Okay, so maybe we can start. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Beauvoir webinar series, and welcome back to those who've already attended previous sessions. For those who are attending for the first time, let me just introduce very briefly the program to you. The Beauvoir webinar series is an online seminar on current issues on Beauvoir studies organized by the International Simone de Beauvoir Society, but which goes beyond Beauvoir as we address themes that are relevant to our contemporary preoccupations, as you can see from the list of previous sessions, which you can also watch on our YouTube channel. In today's session, we are delighted to welcome back Kathryn Sophia Belle on the occasion of the publication of her new book, Beauvoir and Belle, a Black feminist critique of the second sex. Kathryn will present her book in a minute, and she'll probably say a few words on the title too, so I don't want to be too long. I just want to thank you, Kathryn, for accepting my invitation to come to discuss your work today, because we were all looking forward to your book, especially since your first participation in the webinar 3 years ago, I think. I can't remember, maybe 2 years ago, when you introduced us to your ongoing project during the session on Beauvoir, sexism and racism. For those who have not had the chance to know Kathryn's work yet, let me introduce her properly. Kathryn Sophia Belle is former associate professor of philosophy and affiliate faculty in African American studies, as well as women's gender and sexuality studies at the Pennsylvania State University. Her primary research and teaching interests lie in African American philosophy, Black feminist philosophy, continental philosophy, especially existentialism, and critical philosophy of race. She published articles on race, assimilation, feminism, intersectionality, and sex and sexuality. And she's the author of Hannah Arendt and the Negro Questions, published in 2014, and she co-edited an anthology titled Convergences, Black Feminism and Continental Philosophy in 2010. And Beauvoir and Belle, a Black feminist critique of the second sex, is her most recent book, published a few days ago. And to discuss the book with its author, we have two brilliant scholars. First of all, Sabine Broeck. I'm sorry, I'm hoping I'm not mispronouncing. Okay, thank you. She's a professor of philosophy at the University of Bremen. Her primary research and teaching interests are American studies, gender studies, and transatlantic diaspora studies. She's the author of Gender and the Objection of Blackness in 2018, and White Amnesia, Black Memory, Women's Writing and History in 1999. And she co-edited several books, such as Audre Lorde's Transnational Legacies in 2015, and Black Knowledges, Black Struggles, Essays in Critical Epistemology in 2015. Welcome, Sabine, and thank you for accepting to participate today. And Kristen Malley-Mason is an assistant professor of philosophy at Haverford College and former president of the International Simone de Beauvoir Society. Her doctoral thesis, titled An Ethical Disposition Toward the Erotic, the Early Autobiographical Writings of Simone de Beauvoir and Black Feminist Philosophy, is an important contribution to the field in that it draws parallels from Beauvoir's autobiographical work to key themes in the Black feminist writings of Audre Lorde, Bell Hooks, and Patricia Hill Collins on the erotic. She has published several articles in existentialism, phenomenology, feminist philosophy, and critical race philosophy. She is currently working on a book manuscript titled Intersectional Ambiguity, Simone de Beauvoir, Women of Color Feminisms, and the Difference Makes. And we hope, Qrescent, that we will have the opportunity to discuss your book in the webinar. Welcome to the three of you, and thank you for being with us today. So first, Kathryn is going to present her book, and then she will be in conversation with Sabine and Qrescent. And the floor is all yours, and I will manage the Q&A. Don't worry about that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. So thanks to the Simone de Beauvoir Society for hosting this and Maureen for the invitation. Thanks, of course, to Sabine and Qrescent for taking the time to read and engage my book for this purpose and for this event, especially as we're transitioning into summer and, want to do summer things. So thank you guys for being here and being part of this. Thanks also to everyone who showed up in the Zoom. I appreciate you taking the time to be here. So I'm going to present this in three parts. The first part is going to focus on early reception of the book, mostly just looking at the reader reports from when the book went out for review. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the motivations for the book, and then I'll get into just an overview of the chapters and the core arguments. So I'm going to jump right into it. So I would like to thank the 4 readers who took the time to review this manuscript and write amazing things about it. The press opted not to include blurbs on the back of the book, but I do want to share a few highlights from the 4 readers just to give a sense of the early reception of this text. So one reader says, Bell's arguments against analogical, comparative, and competing frameworks of oppression are persuasive and timely. These arguments make this book essential reading for feminists across disciplines and bear on some of the most heated discussions in feminism today. In sum, Bell's approach is both generous and critical and rigorously researched and carefully argued. The book is beautifully written and a pleasure to read. The second reader writes, anchored by a close reading of The Second Sex, Belle employs a brilliant strategy for bringing Black women and women of color feminists into dialogue with Beauvoir and challenging her analogical approach to the grand historical narratives of her text. Passionate and original, Beauvoir and Belle is a vital corrective to Beauvoir's work. I can't imagine teaching The Second Sex without it. Reader 3 writes, the book contributes a consequential argument for that the great majority of the secondary literature on Beauvoir from the mid-century through to today has omitted from its consideration, from bibliographies, anthologies, discussion, the lineage of Black feminist responses to and engagements with Beauvoir. The volume is extremely valuable as a sheer guide to this literature in all its amplitude. As a result, Beauvoir scholars, those working in critical race studies and many strands of feminist thought will benefit and be grateful for Belle's meticulous introduction to debates that have been consequential in these dialogues. Belle more than demonstrates the impoverishment of scholarship on Beauvoir that neglects the perspectives of Black feminism while also building up new foundations for these conversations. And finally, reader 4 writes, Kathryn Sophia Belle's work, both on the page and off, holds a necessary and unique place in the history of philosophy in the United States, particularly in the area of Black feminist philosophy, of which she is at the forefront. This manuscript is no exception. It is both necessary and unique, and the field of philosophy has a dearth of works of its kind. There is no other text, to my knowledge, that brings together Black women and women of color feminist philosophers engaging Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, qua Black feminists. As such, the correctives she offers here are long overdue. After the publication of this work, white feminist thinkers who work on Beauvoir will be forced to engage the women of color feminists they have long ignored. Belle's book is the kind that scholars working on The Second Sex will need to reference or consult in order to claim a feminist and or intersectional feminist lens from its publication forward. There is no doubt that it will impact the field. Okay, so from there, I'm going to get into an overview of how I got into this project and the chapters. So the title of my book is inspired by the essay, True Philosophers, Beauvoir and Belle, by Bell Hooks, who asserts, Simone de Beauvoir as intellectual, philosopher, cultural critic, and as a politically radical leftist woman, chartered a path that was vital to me throughout my process of my intellectual growth. But Hooks also notes, influenced by the life and writing of Beauvoir, it was essential for me to move beyond her focus on woman as other to bring together critical perspectives for understanding that female identity is shaped by gender, race, and class, and never solely by sex. Likewise, Beauvoir and Belle, a Black feminist critique of the second sex, centers Black feminist frameworks of identity and oppression, contextualizing the discourses and vocabularies we have created to articulate our existence and experience at the intersections of race, class, and gender, and other categories for over 2 centuries. Focusing on the rich and diverse historical and philosophical developments of Black women thinkers, Black women as thinkers, speakers, writers, and political actors is valuable in and of itself, and it also anchors my Black feminist critique of Beauvoir's The Second Sex. My intention is to center some of the feminist frameworks, discourses, and vocabularies of Black women and other women of color that existed prior to and have continued after the second sex. This approach also functions as a corrective to some of the exclusionary tendencies in the second sex itself. Having said that, I also take seriously the ways that Black women and other women of color have productively engaged this text. I'm also exposing the ways that the existing Beauvoir scholarship has mostly ignored these engagements, thereby replicating Beauvoir's exclusions in the text. I make the following main arguments about the second sex. Despite its noteworthy contributions and insights, some of the limitations of the text include the analogical approach to identity and oppression, the deployment of comparative and competing frameworks of oppression, as well as the ways in which Black women and other women of color are either not engaged at all in some cases or problematically engaged in other cases in the text. Additionally, focusing on select secondary literature, I argue that while seeking to enshrine Beauvoir in the gilded halls of philosophy, much of the white feminist philosophical secondary literature on the second sex duplicates her exclusions of Black women and other women of color. For example, by not citing Black feminists and other women of color feminists who explicitly take up this text, or by citing but not substantively engaging the arguments offered by Black women and other women of color, thereby perpetuating the very silencing of women's voices they often decry in the discipline of philosophy. I would like to make explicit my citational practices in this text. I am committed to prioritizing citations of and engagements with Black women and other women of color as relevant to this project. Nonetheless, there are still citations of Black men, as well as citations of white women, and even some white men when pertinent to the intentions of my aims of the project. Concerning my engagements with and citations of the second sex, I am not providing an overview of the text as a whole, nor am I offering a response to white women's responses to this text. Those books have already been written, and if you're interested in those topics, you should read the extant literature. Rather, I'm focusing on those aspects of the text that best show Beauvoir's use of analogies, for example, the race-gender analogy and the woman-slave analogy, her comparative and competing frameworks of oppression, for example, racism, sexism, classism, colonialism, as well as her lack of and/or problematic engagements with Black women and women of color. Concerning my engagements with and citations of white feminist secondary literature on the second sex, I have intentionally focused almost exclusively on white feminists who have taken seriously racial critiques of this text, as well as critiques of the use of analogies in this text. So if you think I should cite white feminist analyses of the other in Beauvoir, or you think I should talk about how Beauvoir thinks about white women across class difference, or you think I should talk about how if we read Beauvoir in a certain kind of way, she actually is kind of very intersectional, or you want to question how Beauvoir could possibly have been expected to know anything at all about Black women, then you are deflecting to defend Beauvoir, you are recentering whiteness, specifically white womanness, and you are missing my point. I have lost patience with white women who assume that I and/or other Black women and women of color critique the text because we did not read it in its entirety or because we somehow just did not understand it. We read it, we understood it, and on that basis, we have critiques of it. I'm filled with gratitude every time a student or community member tells me that they use my work to help them articulate their own critiques and/or to push back on professors and other interlocutors who insist on pretending that such shortcomings in these philosophical texts do not exist. If my commitment to my reading and writing process continues to offer some methodologies and theoretical resources for others who see similar issues and have similar concerns, then that is an added bonus for which I also have gratitude. Okay, so now I'm in the final section, which is just an overview of the chapters. So the book is written at the intersections of a lot of multiple tensions. On the one hand, I'm centering and amplifying the voices of Black women and other women of color. On the other hand, I'm bringing attention to their connections to Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex and demonstrating the myriad ways that their feminist frameworks exceed the limits of that figure and text, providing viable alternatives and correctives. To be sure, these Black feminist and women of color feminist frameworks are significant in their own right. My goal is not to ground the significance of their work in the shortcomings of Beauvoir and white feminism, or for that matter, to recenter white feminism even as I critique it. Rather, my goal is to highlight Black women and other women of color feminisms, which includes taking seriously their responses to the second sex, including my own. These tensions inform the organizational structure of the book. So in part one, the first 4 chapters intentionally foreground Black feminist philosophy and praxis, while also exploring direct and indirect connections with the second sex. Chapter 1, a select genealogy of Black feminist frameworks for identities and oppressions. If we are not careful, the work we are doing now is going to have to be rediscovered at some point. Offers a selective genealogy of Black feminist frameworks for identity and oppression that underscores the creation of discourses and vocabularies that express our existence and experience. I argue that Black women have a matrilineal legacy of creating discourses and vocabularies to express our existence and experience, going back to Lucy Terry and Phyllis Wheatley in the context of 18th century colonial America. And furthermore, that Black women have been offering what I now characterize as feminist frameworks for identity and oppression, going back to Maria Stuart in the late 19th century, as early as 1831, that continue to this day. Chapter 2, Claudia Jones, the Negro question in the United States as prior to and not equal to the woman question, examines Jones's Black left internationalist feminist analyses and activism as presented in her essay, An End to the Neglect of the Problems of the Negro Women. I argue that Jones's triple oppression analysis takes seriously the simultaneity of racial oppression, gender oppression, and class oppression in ways that explicitly center and make visible Black women's lived experience, as well as their militant agency. I also argue that although Jones and Beauvoir take quite different approaches to the issues of their time, both publishing their most popular text in 1949, Jones must be credited for facilitating one of the earliest recoveries of the second sex in the United States context. Chapter 3, Lorraine Hansberry, The Second Sex May Well Be the Most Important Work of This Century, offers a close reading of Lorraine Hansberry's critical commentary on the second sex. I argue that unlike Beauvoir, who emphasizes women's complicity and compares women's oppression to other systems of oppression, but ultimately privileges the former over the latter, Hansberry emphasizes the non-complicity and agitation of the oppressed, and she prefers historical materialism to existentialism. Chapter 4, Audre Lorde, Difference is that raw and powerful connection from which our personal power is forged, takes up Lorde's iconic essay, The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House, presented at a 1979 conference commemorating the 30th anniversary of the publication of The Second Sex. I argue that Lorde's 1979 remarks and Jessica Benjamin's reflections on Lorde over 2 decades later in 2000 offers a case study for problematic white feminist engagement with Black feminist thought and thinkers. Part 2 of the text offers 3 additional chapters that focus on Beauvoir's analogical approach to identity and oppression, as well as her brief but telling account of abolition and suffrage in the United States. So Chapter 5, Simone de Beauvoir's analogical approach, there are deep analogies between the situations of women and Blacks, gives a close textual analysis of the use of the race-gender analogy and other comparative and competing frameworks of oppression in the second sex. I make the following main arguments. 1, Beauvoir's comparative and competing frameworks of oppression pose at least 2 problems. On the one hand, she collapses diverse systems of oppression as the same, and on the other hand, she also attempts to distinguish among these systems of oppression by privileging gender difference and oppression above other forms of identity and oppression. 2, Beauvoir's utilization of the race-gender analogy omits the experiences and oppressions of Black women and other women of color who experience racial and gender oppression simultaneously. And furthermore, 3, even when white feminists critique Beauvoir's use of analogies and/or other comparative and competing frameworks of oppression, they often do not cite and engage Black and Latina feminists who have taken up these issues in Beauvoir. Chapter 6 is titled Slavery and Womanhood, Assimilating Woman to the Slave is a Mistake. and it distinguishes the aforementioned race-gender analogy from the slave woman analogy. For example, when Beauvoir portrays woman as enslaved by man, enslaved by domestic duties, and enslaved by the body's reproductive functions for the species, as well as her use of Hegel's master-slave dialectic as a theoretical framework for the subjugation of women. I argue that Beauvoir's historical and metaphorical accounts of slavery do not adequately address racialized slavery. As a corrective, I examine critiques of her use of the slave woman analogy, while also taking seriously the lived experience of enslaved Black women in the United States. Chapter 7 is titled Abolition and Suffrage Movements in the United States. They undertook a campaign in favor of the Blacks, and it takes up claims made by Alva Myrtle and by Beauvoir about abolition and suffrage movements in the United States. Both suggest that white women fought for abolition only to be betrayed by Black men on the issue of suffrage. I argue that a more nuanced understanding is available in the counter-narratives offered by thinkers and activists like Ida B. Wells Barnett, Angela Davis, Bell Hooks, and Paula Giddings, all of whom recover the leadership roles of Black women and men in the abolition and suffrage movement. Finally, part 3 presents the final chapter that takes up the second sex beyond the Black-white binary and the United States focus. So chapter 8, the coloniality of gender, the category of other is as original as consciousness itself, examines Beauvoir's analysis of the situation and oppression of woman as other. I argue that when Beauvoir explicitly takes up non-white, non-Western women in this text, this uptake is often presented through the colonial gaze and imaginary that seeks to lock these other others into a perpetual primitive past, even in her present moment. I turn to insightful analyses of Beauvoir presented by Sally Markowitz, who critiques her Orientalism, Alia Al-Saji, who critiques her colonial tourist gaze and colonial dissonance. And I also explore Kyoo Lee's more generous readings while taking seriously Stephanie Rivera Berruz's critiques. Finally, I turn to the counter-narratives offered by Maria Lugones in her analysis of the coloniality of gender and the importance of decolonial feminisms, as well as Oyèrónké Oywùmí's critical analysis of colonialism and gender imposition from the West. The conclusion, Simone de Beauvoir, I think The Second Sex will seem like an old, dated book after a while, but nonetheless a book which will have made its contribution, takes up interviews with Beauvoir about the second sex and how her relationship to the text evolved over time between 1974 to 1979. For example, in a 1976 interview with John Duracy, Simone de Beauvoir and the Second Sex 25 years later, she acknowledges the limits of the text and says that if a project like that were to be done again, it should be a more collaborative effort with different women speaking from their own lived experiences and situations. Unfortunately, she goes on to undermine this important insight when she also asserts that Black women in America should be listening to white women instead of supporting Black men. She assumes we are ignorant of our own oppression and should be enlightened by white women liberators to raise our consciousness about our situations. I revisit Audre Lorde's open letter to Mary Daly and its implications for Beauvoir and the second sex. I also revisit identity politics and intersectionality as colonial practices, come back to Maria Lugones on decolonial feminism and coalition, and conclude with Mariana Ortega's call for coalitional politics and a praxis of intersectional philosophy. So that concludes my overview, and I'm looking forward to getting into the discussion with Sabine and Qrescent.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know what so thank you, Kathryn. I appreciate it so much. Thank you and congratulations. I guess sort of what I was thinking, maybe, I'm not sure, Sabine, if you want to my questions are sort of like sort of wide lens kind of questions. So I'm not sure if maybe, Sabine, you want to start with your questions and then move on to opening up the space.
I think I have the same sort of problem. So I would just, I defer to you and you just begin and then I keep adding.
Okay, sure. That works out. Well, okay, so we can start maybe sort of in the introduction. I mean, one of the things that you mentioned in the introduction was how throughout your time in philosophy and I guess sort of in maybe Beauvoir studies, it was very sort of clear to you that these issues were arising not only in the way that people were approaching the text, but also in the way that people are sort of organizing themselves around engaging in the contemporary moment as well. So I was thinking about like, you know, this sort of issues, the issues that you bring up that are a part of or inherent to the second sex seem to be sort of across the board in Beauvoir's work. You know, they seem to have like wide implication for Beauvoir's work as a whole. And so I wondered about like sort of centering it in the second sex, particularly like why you sort of chose that as a kind of organizational sort of text around these sort of to center these critiques around.
Thank you for that. So I decided to take a slightly different approach to the Beauvoir book than the one I took in the Arendt book. So like in my Hannah Arendt book, I took a core theme of the Negro question and tracked that across a lot of her writings, right? And so the main argument around Hannah Arendt was that she was like the philosopher who wasn't racist, who did not fall into the trap of the Western philosophical tradition because she's the philosopher of pluralism. And people would say like, you know, there was that problematic Little Rock essay, but if we bracket the Little Rock essay, like the rest of her corpus shows up. And so my approach in the Arendt book was to say, let's do a deep dive on what's going on in Reflections on Little Rock, and then map out how the argument, the problematic argument in Reflections on Little Rock is actually the argument that shows up in The Human Condition, in Origins of Totalitarianism, and On Revolution, and On Violence, and all of these texts, right? So I decided to take like one core theme and trace that across her writings. I took a different approach with the Beauvoir project because the second sex, I feel like, is probably the most influential and well-known of her texts, even though people, I think people don't always read the whole thing, but I think, you know, it's the text, it's like, it becomes like the kind of go-to text for people to, you know, map out a lot of like, for example, think about like Butler's notion of the sex gender distinction that she kind of attributes to Beauvoir in ways that are not necessarily in there, but people kind of take that and run with that in a certain kind of way. So I feel like it's been one of those really influential texts, but it's also such a long and massive text, almost 1,000 pages. I wanted to do a deep dive of like, okay, how are these issues showing up in this particular text instead of tracing them across other texts? But I think a similar approach, like this would be like a 500-page book if I took a similar approach of like, okay, this is the starting point with the second sex, and let's see how it shows up in Beauvoir's other writings. But I'm hoping to provide a kind of methodology and framework in approaching the second sex that could then be replicated in other writings of Beauvoir's, whether it's essays or shorter texts or the novels or even the memoirs for that matter. So it just ended up being like a slightly different approach of like the kind of one main issue across text that I took with the Arendt book, and then like several issues, but focusing on a main text that I think is one of the more influential texts by Beauvoir for this second project. I mean, and the other thing is like I didn't actually intend on writing a book on Beauvoir. When I finished up the Arendt book, my dissertation had been on Arendt, Sartre, and Fanon. The initial intention was to separate that into 2 books. So I was going to do this Arendt book, and then I was going to do like a Sartre and Fanon book on race and colonialism. But in the meantime, I published that, I co-edited the Convergences, Black Feminism and Continental Philosophy book. And my chapter for that book was on Beauvoir and the race-gender analogy. And then that essay got so much uptake that people were like asking me to, you know, say more about it. And then like Margaret Peg Simons reached out and was like, you know, nobody's really taken up how I've taken this up. Like, I would love to see you do more with this. So I was just getting a lot of encouragement from other people in response to that one essay that came out that was never meant to be a book project. I thought it was going to be a one and done kind of thing. And then I ended up doing like a follow-up on the woman and slave analogy, and then ended up doing like one other follow-up thing on like the comparative and competing frameworks. And so once I had those 3 chapters, I was like, okay, well, I could actually expand this out into a larger book project. I also had some graduate students at the time who were working on Beauvoir. So I ended up, you know, just teaching more grad seminars on Beauvoir and engaging her work more. And so, you know, it's a book that I didn't plan on writing that, but that ended up, you know, coming. And actually I got annoyed and bored with it when I was just focusing on like that second section, which is where I do the more deeper dive on the second sex itself. So part of what helped keep me going was what was so enriching was the ways that Black women and other women of color were engaged in the text, and how there was like no engagement with that in the secondary literature, right? So it ceased to be a project that was just a critique of the second sex, and it became this more kind of positive project of like, how do we celebrate and highlight these brilliant insights from Black women and other women of color on this text that have like gone either unmentioned altogether, or people do the kind of requisite, put it in the footnotes, but don't actually engage with the arguments of the text. So, you know, the middle of the book became my critique along with some other critiques, and then the front and tail end of the book, like I then sandwiched it or bookended it with these robust engagements by Black women and women of color that had been under engaged in the existing secondary literature.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if you view yourself like that, but sort of having sort of read those articles, that initial one, and then the responses. I don't know if you view yourself as sort of like a reluctant Beauvoir scholar, but it seems like, oh, Kathryn is doing some more Beauvoir. Like why is it? But I see how it proliferates, you know. I mean, I think the book does very well to show like sort of how even entering in that space like proliferates this other thing that's actually really super valuable as well. Yeah.
I also think it's interesting that Beauvoir and Arendt are probably the two best known women philosophers, right? And that my two kind of main books are on those two figures, although are very critical of those figures. I also think it's interesting that both of them are formally trained as philosophers, and both of them reject the label of philosopher, right? And so we could have a conversation about that as well. But you know, those are some interesting things about like these two books when I put them side by side and think about those two figures side by side. Go ahead, Sabine, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually one of the things that I thought was the biggest strength or success of the book is to, I mean, it's sort of this kind of, I hate the word, but a masterclass of, you know, like how one can do Black feminist philosophy, because it's this wide angle scope about all this agnotological reception of Beauvoir and then the Black feminist engagement with her, but it's also like almost forensic, like going into all these lacunae and contradictions and suppressions in the text. And I think these two in combination is you create like environment for the second sex that hasn't existed anywhere else before. And I think it becomes really like this model for how to engage with, you know, white feminist theory, or even other theories for that matter, is to write sort of entirely different narratives about it with the help of all these environments that are political, social, activist, also philosophical, literary, etc. So, and in this context, my first question would be about the, you know, you make a distinction between her employment of race-gender analogy and her employment of the slave, you know, woman as slave analogy. And I'm very interested if you could say a little more about the tension between these two things, because I think part of the problem, I looked at some of the secondary literature again too, is that it has been almost like this kind of chic trope recently to say, yeah, we can't conflate race with gender. And so race-gender analogy has gotten like a little bit of a bad name, but it's also, I think, a very cheap kind of evasion of the issues, because everybody then seems to assume that if you can say that, then the anti-Blackness of the you know, woman as slave analogy and her treatment of the slave as this kind of trope. I mean, I don't think she has any interest in, you know, Black enslavement whatsoever to me, but she uses this as a trope. And so these two things don't necessarily articulate as one. So I'm just really interested in, you know, your more explanation of why you took so much care in separating them also.
Well, I could see that both were like, and this is like what those three middle chapters end up dealing with, right? Because I could see what was going on with the race gender analogy, and that was the first chapter that I wrote that was in the convergences piece. But then as I did like the closer reading and the deeper dive, I was like, oh, but there's also this woman as slave analogy which is not the same. Like there are times when they overlap, but there are times when they're very different. And so I wanted to really tease out and do that close reading of like, okay, how is the race gender analogy showing up? how is the woman as slave analogy showing up? What's this kind of historical narrative she's given to the development of it? How is Hegel showing up in that? And there's a lot of literature on like how she's using Hegel or how she's appropriating Hegel or deploying Hegel and things like that. But I thought that they were being collapsed into one. So I don't think they're mutually exclusive, but they're also not one and the same. And so the best way to kind of tease that out was to say like, okay, let's look closely at specifically how is the race gender analogy working, and what are some other comparative and competing frameworks of oppression she's using, right? So you have like the woman, the race gender analogy, you have the analogy between what she calls anti-feminism and colonialism, anti-feminism and like the proletariat and class issues, anti-feminism and anti-Semitism, right? And so there are all of these comparisons that are happening that are not only the race gender analogy, but that are operating alongside of that. So that's why I kind of fleshed that out in one chapter. And then I want to unpack separately, even though again, there's overlaps and connections, well, what exactly is going on with this woman as slave analogy, and look at how Beauvoir is doing it specifically in The Second Sex, but also how that has been used historically in, for example, abolition campaigns and then the transition to suffrage campaigns, right? So historically, how has this woman I mean, and again, they sometimes operate alongside of one another, but they're not exactly the same thing. So I didn't want to collapse them, even though I didn't want to suggest that they were mutually exclusive. So it just took like unpacking the various, like following the various threads and seeing where they went and how they were showing up. And then ultimately, like I agree, I don't think she's that interested in the issue of like enslaved Black folks, whether in the US context or in the French context, right? And I think another thing that's operating here, and I talk about this in the Arendt book as well, I think the US tends to project the issue of imperialism onto Europe as if the Europeans are the colonizers and the imperialist nations. And then Europe wants to project slavery onto the US as if that was like a thing that was going on in the Americas. But both sides are complicit in both, right? Mm-hmm. And so there are times when Beauvoir, for example, there's like one or two places where she actually mentions the issue of like the colonized, not in general, but like specifically looking at like how the Black man who isn't colonized is experiencing X, Y, or Z, right? So there's not a complete lack of awareness of what's going on. There's just like she makes a choice about like when and how frequently she engages or does not engage that. But again, as a corrective to her kind of not taking up or not perhaps being interested in what's going on with slavery in the US context, even though she's obviously very fascinated with what's going on with race in the US context and writes a whole, memoir dealing with it in America Day by Day, for example. I wanted to offer a counter narrative by saying like, okay, there are actually a number of scholars that have taken up the specific, the lived experience of enslaved Black women, and the lived experience of enslaved Black women is very different from this analogy and metaphor of slavery that you're using. And that, again, that also comes up in her, like the fact that she even takes up abolition and suffrage, which is just like a small 1 or 2 paragraphs in The Second Sex. But I think it's interesting that it's there. I think it's influenced by Alva Myrtle's A Parallel to the Negro Question, which is in An American Dilemma, which we know was like a kind of aspirational text for her for The Second Sex. She initially planned on writing like a shorter text like Sartre's Anti-Semite and Jew. And then she sees An American Dilemma, which is this massive 2-volume encyclopedic study. And she's like, oh, I want to do a big project like that, right? So she's reading An American Dilemma. She doesn't cite Alva Myrtle, but that's a appendix in that text. And there are a lot of parallels between Alva Myrtle's analysis and Beauvoir's analysis. So I map out that connection as well.
Not to take your question, but this is one of the questions that I think you were maybe going to answer, Sabine, that I'm actually interested in related to this, is about the sort of legacy of Hegelian, the sort of Hegelian dialectic in her work, and why. I mean, I think maybe you might want to ask your own question, but I think it's really relevant here because I think, and to your point, I mean, Sabine says like this legacy affected not only the way that Beauvoir is understanding these analogies, but also the ways that they're then taken up by white feminists and other sort of secondary literature around. So I'm interested in that. And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, can I just add to that? I mean, what really particularly struck me is that the reception, her reception of Hegel functions through Kojève and this conflation, this kind of transformation of Hegel's Herrenknecht, which to me is like something totally different. And then Kojève's making of the Knecht into the slave, and then the entire Anglo-Saxon tradition following suit, which was this major mobilization of this slave metaphor. And what is for me most important is that the use that I think she takes of this is to picture the slave as slavish, because that's what she needs to do in order to issue her call to women's subjectivity. So in order for women to sort of come into their fullest humanity, they have to get beyond their slavishness. And I think so what she enabled like white women to feel or to do was this combination between their own sort of like liberatory desire, but immediately coupled to this anti-Blackness of, you know, I don't want to be a slavish person anymore, as if the slaves ever were slavish. So, and this combination of creating like white feminist subjectivity that's sort of wants to be free on the basis of being not anti-slavery, but anti-slavishness, to me is like, like her most reckless move, basically. And so that's what I would be interested in like methodologically, because I think if you can do that with her in this really wonderful way, like from, you know, top down, but also forensically, then like how much work do we have before that to do that with so many other texts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it needs to be done with a lot of these texts. And I think the issue is like like the Western philosophical tradition just kind of continues a similar narrative with the same old questions and the same old figures. And I think one of the things, what's keeping philosophy alive, if it is alive at all, is what's being done with like critical philosophy of race and Black feminism and Latina feminism, right? Like it's people of color who are coming in who are not just using the master's tools, right, but who are coming in with very different questions and radically disrupting these assumed narratives that have just been kind of passed down and taken for granted, right? And so even though I think figures like a Hannah Arendt and a Simone de Beauvoir want to be very critical of the Western philosophical tradition, they remain stuck within that tradition. And so one of the ways that I'm trying to disrupt that is by saying like the Western philosophical tradition is not our only source for thinking or theorists or frameworks, right? And so that's why I start the book out with these genealogies of Black feminist vocabularies and frameworks for identity and oppression that are not directly tied to or always responding to these other kind of what you call like misframings of what's going on there. So I think it is important to like pay attention to these legacies that have been passed down for reading certain figures and certain frameworks in particular kind of ways, and how it just it gets taken for granted that that is just the way this figure should be read. That's just the way, you know, the figure should be taken up. And then look at like how people are, you know, what graduate students are being punished for pushing back on that, for saying, well, this is not my experience, or this is like, I think we think about this differently, or this other figure says this much more interesting thing about this than this person does, right? And in terms of like the professional academic structure of philosophy, that's something that often gets punished and pushed back against rather than, you know, celebrated. But the people who survive the disciplining of training as in the discipline of philosophy are able to, you know, disrupt some of these narratives in part by going outside of a very narrow, myopic kind of list of like what texts and what figures count. But I think but again, like one of the reasons why this book ends up coming out is that it's like, okay, I do take seriously the impact that the second sex has had and the impact that the figures Beauvoir is engaging have had on the second sex. And so what does it look like to disrupt the kind of impact that, or at least name and acknowledge and critique how the impact that this text has had and how other people have had to respond to this text, or how other people have kind of created a whole framework of their own that is not always already or only a response to this text, if that makes sense. So I want to like address both sides of it. Like, let's acknowledge the place that this text has had. And I don't think it should not have a place in the history of philosophy, right? Like, again, she's, you know, in my baseline for what counts as philosophy is actually pretty low, but she's formally trained as a philosopher. She should be read in philosophy classrooms and things like that. So I'm not saying don't read Arendt or don't read Beauvoir, but what does it mean to read them more critically and take seriously like what some of the problematics are in those texts?
So I'm thinking about positioning. One of the chapters that I really, really love in the book is this chapter on Audre Lorde, where you're talking about, you mentioned this in the introduction, where you're contextualizing one of her most famous essays and one of the sort of quotes that gets taken up by her over and over again. But contextualizing it within sort of a response to being invited to this Second Sex Anniversary Conference, and that, you know, the rest of the text is exploring how that is a result of certain exclusions and ways that the sort of conference itself was organized. And so I think, and then also you take up Jessica Benjamin's response years later, the organizer of the conference, you know, having, you know, have this essay sort of blown up and everyone is discussing it even years later, to think about in reflection on the conference itself, to reinscribe the same sort of like exclusions and ways of orienting oneself toward women of color, just seems sort of very disappointing. And so for me, it's one of my favorite chapters in the book because it's such a microcosm for the experience of being a sort of Black feminist philosopher in these institutions and spaces kind of generally. And so I was just wondering, I mean, I guess I just sort of have kind of like questions about like sort of the lived experience of that, how that bears on the lived experience, and how, you know, you see this text as a sort of intervention. I mean, there's a way in which this text is important because it forces the white feminists who have been participating in these exclusions to look at the sort of rich history of women of color responding to the text. And yet also there's some way in which there's still a sort of, it has to be, for example, the book launch is happening in the Simone de Beauvoir society, in which we sort of look around and see as a largely sort of white feminist kind of society itself. So just thinking about like those inclusions and exclusions that the book sort of, for me, just sort of encapsulates.
So many layers, right? So I love this question, praise the Lord, Lorde, for an Audre Lorde question, right? So in terms of, so I'll start with the end point of me even being in space. Of course, you were the former president of this organization and first invited me into this space. So part of the reason why I'm here today is because you laid the groundwork for that, because I have this positive association of the organization with you as its president, and not necessarily with what the typical demographic of the space is, right? So they have you to thank for my doing this virtual event with them, and I'm glad that you agreed to be in conversation with me. But yeah, I think there are a lot of layers. Like, I'm struck by a lot of things. Like with this Beauvoir and I'm sorry, with this Lorde and Benjamin connection in particular, I was really taken aback by that open letter that she wrote in 2000, right? Like, so, because I mean, of course, like we can talk about the frustrations that Lorde is articulating real time in 1979 with what's going on in 1979. But given all the literature that has come out since then, and of course we can talk about what was happening before then, but there's a lot that has happened in terms of access to scholarship, essays, anthologies, books around these issues, and that she could, in the year 2000, double down on her position and try to vilify and stigmatize and delegitimize Lorde in that space, and like have a temper tantrum about what Lorde did at her conference like in 2000. I was really taken aback by that. I'm like, in the 21st century, right? And so what strikes me about this in terms of just like the institutional structures of it is how, and again, this is why I started the book where I started. I'm like, okay, I can trace back to Lucy Terry and Phyllis Wheatley, Black women articulating our identities and oppressions, right? Like we have over 2 centuries of that. This is not like Black women did not jump on some white feminist bandwagon. We did not discover ourselves as oppressed after reading The Second Sex. Like we had a bunch of literature that was available to us before The Second Sex. We've had literature that has been available to us after that. But I'm struck by how we've had to constantly re-articulate the same arguments over and over again, right? And Hortense Spillers talks about this when she, in an interview, when she's talking about her Mama's Baby Papa's Maybe essay. And she's like, you know, if we're not careful, we're going to have to like constantly rediscover and re-articulate like what the things that we've already had to do. And I see that, right? Like I see that happening. And I think I know that's part of why I do the kind of close textual analysis that I do, and why I also go back as far as I do when I do, to say like, okay, this is not new. This is not a new framework for us. But this idea that or even going to the conclusion where Beauvoir is like, oh, well, Black women need to be listening to white women on the issue of oppression. And it's just like, no, we know, like, we're the oppressed know what oppression looks like and feels like and how we want to dismantle it, right? So it's interesting to see it just play out time after time after time, not only historically, say like in the 70s or the 80s or even the 90s, but like, again, into the 21st century, that you still have somebody who, you know, I would expect to know better, not know better, or at least not do better. I was really taken aback by that. So that's like just concerning Lorde and Benjamin, and then just like a general kind of Black feminist, white feminist engagement or contentions. And then in terms of like my own lived experience, I think about, so it's not so much the master's tools that has impacted, like, so for example, we were talking before this started about like my decision to resign / retire / quit from being a philosophy professor, like at the top of my game, about to go for full professor. I have all the publications, I have all the things. And I decided to walk away because it was no longer aligned for me. And I began to feel the weight of like what I call institutional bondage, right? So like in the master's tools essay, Audre Lorde refers to this as like the psychic milking that happens, right? Like the extraction of our labor that happens in these institutional structures. And like Patricia Hill Collins talks about it as a type of annexation. And she also engages Lorde on this in Black feminist thought. And I use the language of institutional milking. So I definitely had gotten to a place where I could feel that on the one hand, the more I did, the more it was suggested that I was not doing enough, right? So I'm doing all the publications, like I'm speaking at Oxford, my book is published with Oxford, you know, I'm doing all of these kinds of things, the kind of external markers of prestige or excellence in the academy, whatever the case may be. I'm running departments, right? Like I'm interim head of one department, I'm directing a center, I'm still working with graduate students, right? I'm still directing dissertations on dissertation committees. And because some of the work that I was doing in terms of my administrative labor was outside of the philosophy department, the narrative within the philosophy department became like, well, when is Kathryn coming back? Like she's doing all of this stuff, as if I wasn't still doing all the things within the philosophy department, right? And so what was interesting to me is like, on the one hand, it was like the more I was doing, the more it was suggested I was not doing. On the other hand, the institution, the departments are still benefiting from exploiting, like they're simultaneously erasing and exploiting the labor. But it's like, I see it, right? Like I'm not stupid, right? So it's like I was in a place where I could name that contradiction of like the simultaneous, like the attempted devaluation and erasure of my labor on the one hand, and the exploitation and extraction of my labor on the other hand. And I was like, I actually don't, you know, have to do this. Like I can actually do something else. So I decided to quit, right? And I tell people I didn't like wake up one morning angry and quit. It was like a decision that was several years in the making. And I, you know, was really intentional about setting myself up in a way that I could walk away without being dependent on the institution that was exploiting me, right? But that's how some of the master's tool stuff works. But then, of course, I always want to go over to the uses of the erotic work, right? Because for Lorde, the erotic is sensuality and sexuality, which I love, you know, I'm team erotic empowerment, but it's also being connected to your sense of purpose, your creativity, you know, how you show up in the world, right? And so she has this line where she says, the erotic is an internal sense of satisfaction to which, once we have experienced it, we know we can aspire. For having experienced the fullness of the depth of feeling and recognizing its power and honor and self-respect, we can require no less of ourselves. And that is where I was when I quit. Like, I know what it feels like to be connected to the erotic, to be connected to a sense of satisfaction, to be connected to my sense of power that is not in any way tied to this institution where I work, right? That's a job, that's where I work, that's not who I am. And so if anything inspired my departure from the academy, it was more the erotic empowerment aspect of things than the master's tools aspect of things, although I would say it was both and.
Thank you.
Could I shift grounds a little bit? I have a question that I didn't, send to you beforehand, like we were exchanging our questions beforehand, but while I was trying to prepare for this, I had another question which is more connected to the current situation and the role that a book like The Second Sex could play in it or not play in it. So I was thinking it's interesting, at least in the German, white feminist context, that people have always read Beauvoir as like our major feminist foremother and not as, say, a critical intellectual that was connected to the anti-colonial scene in Paris. You know, somebody who wrote, I mean, people know that she wrote literature, but that's not. So I'm very interested in the fact of her having been part of this sort of post-Second World War, post-Holocaust, anti-colonial scene in Paris, where everybody seemed to have been present, but the connections, I wonder sometimes about, like, which connections have they really made in terms of content, and how much of it was sort of political, you know, the habit of the day, or posturing, or some kind of rage that was en vogue. And so my question is, like, given the challenges for white feminists, particularly today, you know, like in face of necropolitics and what, you know, my friend Walker just wrote to me, like, it's sort of like global barbarism reigns the day in Palestine and Haiti, in the Congo, in the Sudan, you know, wherever you turn. So where's white feminism? And like, is there any legacy in Beauvoir, since she has been such a major figure, that could be mobilized for those elements, that kind of, you know, moving towards some kind of intersectional, international, anti-imperialist alliance, to be like a little blunt about it? Or is the text really in that sense like unusable because it keeps refocusing people on this kind of white female myopia?
I'm inclined to say it's more the latter than the former, but I think like any text, well, so let me start with, like, I think there are people who have pointed out, like Nancy Bauer and others have pointed out how Beauvoir doesn't get like critically engaged as like womanist thinker, right? And so it's like, again, like there's this kind of paternalistic, you know, feminist foremother who did these great things, but is not really that relevant. And so they do some kind of critical analyses of like, you know, there's actually some deeper arguments and thoughts that are happening in this text than even people who celebrate Beauvoir give her credit for, right? But having said that, even when she is engaging, and I think this is less in the second sex than in other texts, but even when she is engaging issues of like colonialism, imperialism, like anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, and things like that, I think that's the work that gets the least uptake among white feminists, right? Like, so that they want to say that she did it to check the box, but again, they're not actually engaging what she said or what other people that she was in conversation with said, right? So Sartre and Beauvoir don't really, like, what do they have to say about colonialism and imperialism outside of their conversations with people like Frantz Fanon, right? Who's saying that they're not doing enough, right? And so it's always interesting to me, you know, the desire for like the great white savior who said the right thing when there were other Black people who were saying the same thing. And it's just like, but the white person who says it gets more credit than the Black person who said it before the white person. And then people don't actually engage what the Black person said. So I think there's some interesting nuances there. But concerning, like, I think the second sex in any text, I think I've seen people productively and in interesting ways take up threads in certain kind of texts for more productive uses than the author may have even intended. For me, I'm no longer willing to do the kind of mental gymnastics required for that. Like Beauvoir is not my source, Arendt is not my source, right? So even when I was teaching, like when the pandemic first hit in terms of like stuff shutting down, like in spring of 2020, I was teaching a Simone de Beauvoir seminar. And I think we were probably on, I don't remember if we'd finished the second sex, we were reading a bunch of texts. We weren't just reading the second sex. But I remember when all of this stuff was going down, we stopped reading the second. I think we were reading the second sex because I said the second sex is not going to save us. We're switching to Octavia Butler and we're going to read the Parable series because there's more available to you in Parable of the Sower for kind of surviving and navigating the kind of current context that we're in than is available in the second sex, right? Like, so for me, if I'm looking for like a survival manual, Parable of the Sower is going to be my survival manual before like the second sex is going to be my survival manual, right? And part of the reason for that is you have people like Octavia Butler who can anticipate who can acknowledge the interconnections between different systems of oppression and anticipate how those things all come to a head simultaneously, right? So it's not difficult for Octavia Butler to be able to think racism alongside sexism, alongside issues with environmental, climate issues, alongside issues of economics and failings, alongside social structures failing, alongside drug abuse, right? Like, so they're like, it's like literally everything everywhere all at once. And she has the intellectual and emotional and imaginary capacity to imagine, how that unfolds decades later. And we see it, it's almost become prophetic when we read that text in 2024. And like the breakdown of the text actually starts in 2024, interestingly, even though it's written decades ago, right? And when she gets interviewed about that book, somebody asks her, like, well, do you think, do you really think there's no hope? Is it like as doom and gloom as you're anticipating? And so she's like, I'm not advocating for doom and gloom. I'm just taking the problems that I see today and imagining what happens to those problems if we don't do anything about them. Right. And so in that regard, I think Octavia Butler is going to give us more resources for navigating everything that's happening simultaneously. And I was just reading, there's a biography of Margaret Walker written by Mary Emma Graham. And Margaret Walker is interesting because she lived a long time. Her lifespan goes across from the 1930s and 40s through the civil rights movement to the post-civil rights movement. And so she has this interesting vantage point from which she can see the rise and fall of all of these kind of global issues that happen and how to navigate and deal with them, right? And so she's, for example, one of the sections of the text deals with the Jackson State University massacre, which happens, I think, in 68 or 70, where there are students, one high school student and one college, 11 students get shot. I think 2 students are killed on campus. And they're everybody knows about the Kent State massacre, but fewer people know about the Jackson State, Mississippi, not Jackson State University in Mississippi massacre, which is a historically Black university. But at the same time that's happening, of course, the students are protesting the Vietnam War. They're protesting the U.S. also going to Cambodia, right? And so I say that to say there is a long history of these interconnected issues that we're seeing manifest and proliferate in a particular kind of way right now. And I don't think what's happening today is the same as that, but I think we can do a little Octavia Butler work and say, okay, we have this history to draw on and these new versions of these systems of oppression that reinvent themselves. So how do we come up with strategies for addressing them moving forward? But for me, I'm going to go with an Octavia Butler before Simone de Beauvoir.
So we're waiting for the book, Kathryn.
the Butler book.
Butler book. But
well, she already wrote it. You just got to read. You just got to read her.
I think I would probably, that's not a question, it's just a commentary. I mean, what I really thought in terms of being sort of a methodological model and a real an enrichment for teaching if I was still teaching, is that I think you treat Beauvoir with this extreme generosity. I mean, you're very, very on point with all the forensic, critical, racist, whatever details, but the general spirit is I take you seriously and, I engage with you. And I don't think I could even have the patience because sometimes I think there's sort of a polemics hidden in your book that some people will pick up on, I think, and other people might not. And the polemics that I'm picking up on is, in a way, what actually happened with Beauvoir in that period, the post-war anti-colonial ferment period, is the same that happened with Mary Wollstonecraft and Olympe de Gouges in the 18th century. It happened with white feminism after the civil rights movement. So you get to this point where, anti-imperial Black, anti-colonial politics and movements have brought the system to the brink. Everybody knows something else has to happen. And here comes white women sort of focusing all the intention on for women to enter the game. And I think there's a kind of, it deserves a kind of rage. And I'm on the other, I mean, I'm glad you didn't go that way because that makes the book so worthwhile for teaching. But I was wondering if you, I mean, you don't have to answer that, but if you also sometimes felt this, historically, what's been going on then? I mean, to just.
Yeah, I mean, and I did this with the Arendt book as well, right? I'm aware, so they're like with the Arendt book, and I imagine, I'm not sure because the Arendt book, there are similarities between their camps, but there are also some differences between their camps. With the Arendt book, there were like three main receptions. Like there were people who were saying like, you're race baiting, you're overstating, you're trying to paint Arendt in a bad light. She wasn't racist, she's innocent. Like, so I call them the Hannah Arendt is innocent group, right? Who want to defend her at all costs and say like, I'm the person who's racist. Then you have at the opposite end of the end of the extreme, the Hannah Arendt is guilty group who felt like I should have called her racist on every page of the book and like I was too generous and too gentle with her. And then you have people who are somewhere in the middle who are like, I assumed that these issues of racism were just contained to Reflections on Little Rock or like just kind of murmurs on the margins of her work, but you show me that like, oh, actually this is like a consistent thread throughout her work, right? And so I took a similar approach with Beauvoir because I know these are two, again, I think philosophers, they tend to worship at the altar of their figures, whomever those figures are. And then I think when you have like these two particular women philosophers, they get held in a certain kind of esteem because they can be celebrated like as women philosophers who did like all the things, right? And so I wasn't necessarily trying to be gentle with it, but I did want to take seriously, like I didn't want it to just be a tirade of like Hannah Arendt is racist or Simone de Beauvoir is racist. It's like, okay, like let's look at them on their own terms. Like let's look at what the text actually says and kind of take seriously what's going on there instead of like pretending it's on the margins or like something that we can sweep under the rug, right? And again, this is something that happens in the history of philosophy anyway, right? Like people always do these mental gymnastics of like, well, Kant, said these problematic things, but that's his anthropology, that's not his philosophy, right? Like they want to separate and segregate things out that are right there. And so I'm like, okay, what does it mean when we just go line by line through the text and see what the figure said and what are the implications for the claims that the figure made? And then we can kind of make our decisions about how we want to engage or disengage with the figure or what adjustments need to be made. If something fruitful is going to happen with it. But I think, some people have done fruitful things with both Arendt and Beauvoir. So my argument is never like we need to cancel these figures or stop reading their texts. It's just like, what does it look like to take seriously these things that we want to pretend are not there on the margins and actually make them the center of the reading of the text? And I think we get very different texts when we put those things at the center rather than on the margins.
Shall we switch to the floor?
As you wish. Maybe Qrescent, you had another question?
Oh, sorry,
No.
Qrescent.
No, I mean, I have plenty more questions if there are not other questions, but maybe just sort of as a last, sort of my last closing questions. I mean, to sort of point back, one of the other beautiful things about this is you give us such a rich kind of history of Black feminist philosophical thought and also, diasporic and Latina feminist sort of responses. And so I want to sort of point to them maybe sort of in ending kind of my questions and ask you, about, so for example, this Lorraine Hansberry essay has been around forever. I've always run across and said, why are people not really, who is not like, why are people not engaged in this? Lorraine Hansberry is talking about
Lorraine
this.
Hansberry.
It's like, how can this happen? So there were so many like important Black and diasporic thinkers that show up in your book and are treated so seriously and so beautifully. It was really lovely for me. And so I wanted just to ask you of the people that you were included, were there any, particular critiques that you found particularly sharp or figures that you had a fun time sort of sitting with, or just to kind of like point us out to the.
Well, I have to say my favorite parts of this book are not the part two, where I'm critiquing the second sex, which I think is important work. But my favorite parts are like parts one with the Black feminists, and then part three where we're getting into like some of the African feminism and the Latina feminism and like Kyoo Lee's work and Alia Al-Saji's work. So I really love just how brilliant these thinkers are and how relevant their work was, again, not just as a theoretical exercise, but like what's happening in the world, right? Like there's an activism that's connected to their theoretical projects. So I love that in a book on Beauvoir, it starts with a whole chapter tracking Black feminist thought and vocabulary from like Phyllis Wheatley up to like Kimberly Crenshaw, right? Like I love that that's the entry point into the text, and the intention to like, it's very kind of laborious, but the intention is to literally like overwhelm people with how much has been written that not that we, because you and I have not been ignoring that, but that so many people have ignored. Like there are these nuances and these intricate arguments and these theoretical framework and these activisms and people doing things on the ground that have been happening a long time. Again, that was not just tied to like what was going on with Simone de Beauvoir or any kind of white feminist project, even if they're engaged in like the kind of consciousness raising things with white feminists and things like that, right? So I'm really intentional. And that was actually an added chapter. I didn't have that in the book when it first went out for review, but one of the readers was like, you've done so much work on this, it seems a shame, like a missed opportunity to not like highlight that in some way. And so that was a chapter that ended up being added after it went out for review. So I love that that's the first chapter. And then I love that the 3 chapters after that are Claudia Jones and Lorraine Hansberry and Audre Lorde. Like they're such a wonderful trilogy for entering into this conversation. And so of those, I was introduced, well, actually both of them, I want to say both of them are in, I think Claudia Jones is also in the Words of Fire.
In Words of Fire. So that's why I think people don't take it up, because they're not reading Words of Fire.
They're not. And why are you not reading Words of Fire? If you're on this Zoom call and you have not read or have not seen or do not have Words of Fire edited by Beverly Guy Sheftall, get Words of Fire, because it literally goes from like 1831. I think it starts with Maria Stuart. And it doesn't go to Crenshaw because it's like, I think it got published in 90. I think it maybe goes up to maybe Alice Walker is like one of the last figures, goes to like to the 1980s, from like the 1830s to the 1980s. And so it's because, we went to Spelman College. I took a feminist theory course with Beverly Guy Sheftall where we read Words of Fire. So I already had, like, for me, this was my narrative. It wasn't just a counter narrative, right? So by the time I read Beauvoir, and she's talking about this narrative around abolition and suffrage, like I'd already read, and looking at 1949 when this text was published, I'm like, I already read Claudia Jones, so I can see what Claudia Jones is doing in 19 pages that has more impact and is more intersectional than what Beauvoir is doing in like 900 pages, right? Or because I've read Angela Davis's Women, Race, and Class, where she's dealing with like issues of abolition and suffrage, I know this narrative of like white people freed the slaves and then Black men turned their back on them when it came to suffrage is like not an accurate narrative, right? But these are texts that I had access to as an undergraduate. It wasn't something that I got in graduate school or that I had to go find later. Like, so that was always my baseline. So I love that, and it also has this Lorraine Hansberry review, right? So the review of the second sex that Lorraine Hansberry wrote was written in 1957, but didn't get published until it was included in Beverly Guy Sheftall's anthology, which I think came out in like 95. But 95 to 2024, we've had decades to engage with this text and people have not engaged with the text. And part of the issue with me was like, it's Lorraine Hansberry, like it's not somebody, when you think of major women writers and figures, like Lorraine Hansberry is best known for A Raisin in the Sun, but she's not like an unknown, right? In a way that even a Claudia Jones might be for some people, so if an entire kind of secondary literature could ignore somebody like Lorraine Hansberry, then what does it have for other like not as well-known figures? But it was good to do the deep dive on them. And then the interesting thing is Lorraine Hansberry actually praises the book. She's not criticizing it. So I'm like, you're not like, she's on your team in some ways, right? Like there are some critiques and nuances, but she's very like, she has all the praise for the second sex. And I didn't know, like I had put Claudia Jones and Beauvoir together only because their best known works were both published in 49. So I knew I wanted to do something like, again, juxtaposing all that Jones is doing in like 19 pages with what like Beauvoir is not doing in close to 1,000 pages. But it wasn't until I did more research on those connections that I realized that Claudia Jones was actually responsible for blocking a negative review of the second sex in one of the socialist journals, right? And she helped get a serial publication, like a condensed publication of the second sex out. So she's actually one of the first people to recover the second sex for a US audience, right? And again, for all the white feminists who are like, we need to recover Beauvoir, like, why are you not paying attention to the Black woman who was doing it before everybody else started doing it decades later? So those two figures were great. And then of course, Audre Lorde, we always love Audre Lorde. And again, I hadn't made the connection before that the Master's Tools speech was given at a Beauvoir conference, right? And so it was wonderful to see all of these interesting connections, like direct and indirect, between these major Black feminist thinkers that I know and love and what Beauvoir was doing in the second sex and in that conference and things like that. Yeah. So thanks for that question. Oh, thanks. Somebody put the Words of Fire link in the chat for people to get it.
Maybe we can open up to question. I see that Lillian has a question.
It's more a comment than a question, but I'd like for her to respond. The race, or actually the slave woman analogy that Beauvoir uses, really goes way back to Wollstonecraft, who in her book, The Rights of Women, mentioned that, compared women to slaves 87 times in that text. And of course, all through the 19th century, that kept becoming the drumbeat of white women to try to put themselves in that same category for liberation. So that's one comment. And so I'm a historian, so I'm trying to put his Beauvoir's thinking within his longer historical framework. The other thing I've noticed about her when I was doing research was the racism in her book really comes up really strong for me in her critique and rejection of motherhood, because white women are respected and elevated for being mothers, while working class women, enslaved women, reproduce, but they're not given the privilege of motherhood to mother their children, or given, accolades and celebrated for motherhood. So I think motherhood is one of the linchpins for Beauvoir's erasure of Black and lower class women. So I just like to have a comment on that.
Sure. So I'm not a historian, I'm a philosopher, and I make stuff up. And as long as the argument is good, it usually flies, right? Having said that, I am very intentional about putting things in historical context. So I think my work, more than many philosophers, actually I do a lot of archival research, like not to the level of like 10 sources for one claim, like historians kind of do, but there is a lot of archival research in my work and a lot of historical context for the work, right? So I do mention Mary Wollstonecraft and others who took up this trope before Beauvoir, and people who've taken it up since, and how people like Angela Davis and Bell Hooks have taken up how that trope was taken up in the US context, right? So there's a lot of historical context for those claims that get made. And I do engage the issue of Beauvoir on womanhood and how both looking at womanhood and also looking at sexual initiation, right? And so there are ways where Beauvoir explicitly describes sexual initiation as always being a form of rape, right? But does not use that language when she's talking about the sexual exploitation of Black women in the context of slavery, which she does take up in a little bit in America Day by Day, right? And so I cite that. So all of this is taken up in much more intricate detail in the actual text. And I do look at examples of like Claudia Jones in and into the neglect of the problems of Negro women, takes up Black women and motherhood, and she actually looks at like the birth of of Mother's Day, right? Like Mother's Day becoming a national holiday in the United States, and how there's this celebration of mothers, and that celebration is a celebration of white mothers and not Black mothers, right? And she gives these case studies of like different Black women who have been in prison and incarcerated, who have children, whose children are like left without any kind of defense or protection, and how the U.S. government does not celebrate all mothers. They celebrate white mothers because they don't see Black women as mothers, right? Like in the context of slavery, or in the context of like like the Mary Ingram case, and like there's several different case studies that she gives of like cases that are happening real time in 1949. So I wouldn't say motherhood is the linchpin. Like it's one of several. Like there are several different, you can kind of pick your poison when it comes to where Beauvoir goes wrong with race and gender stuff. But motherhood is definitely one of them, and it's an issue that does get taken up in the book.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Feel free to ask your question. You can use the raise your hand tool on Zoom, or just write your question in the chat box.
I want to give people some time, but maybe I'll just jump in again. I've been thinking about the title of the book. both beautiful reference to the bell hooks essay, but also a Black feminist critique. And I was wondering, considering, again, another thing that I love that you do is show like how Black and women of color feminists are entering into critiquing Simone Beauvoir in different spaces. But you title it A Black Feminist Critique. So I'm interested in like why that title, when part of the work is to show sort of like the plethora of different sort of ranges of Black feminism.
So it's the second, I always knew the first part was going to be Beauvoir and Belle. And I went back and forth because people were like, how dare you put your name in the title of a book? And I'm like, look, because I said so, right? Like, trust me, I'm right about this. Y'all are going to be happy that she went with me on this. So I went back and forth with the press a little bit about that. And so they accepted that. And of course, and I did the same thing. I didn't put my name, but the title of the Hannah Arendt and the Negro question was also adapted from Hannah Arendt and the Jewish Question by Bernstein, right? And so my book titles are often inspired by like other book titles that, resonated with me for whatever reason. So that was the first half. The second half, it was like a Black and woman, like it got too clunky when I tried to say like a Black and woman of color feminist critique or an intersectional critique. There were like 4 or 5 different iterations. I settled on a Black feminist critique, identifying myself as the a Black feminist, who was then giving attention to being attentive to all of these other Black feminists and women of color feminist analyses. So the singularity of the A is more me as a single Black feminist taking up this text that then, though, does articulate these various Black feminists and women of color engagements with the text. And even like, again, I'm really attentive to, for the most part, it is looking at Black feminist engagements. We really don't get to the like Mariana Ortega and Stephanie Rivera Berruz and Kyoo Lee and Alia Al-Saji until the end. And I did want that build up to them to show like, again, there's this long history here, but then there's also this stuff that's happening here that we need to pay attention to. So I was happy to be able to make that the kind of grand finale of the book in terms of what they're doing, both again, the explicit engagements with the second sex, as well as kind of broader narratives that don't necessarily name the second sex, but still have implications for the second sex. And so it's been great and part of it is I was working on this project when like Mariana Ortega, I've known for a long time, Alia Al-Saji as well, Kyoo Lee and I think like probably Stephanie Rivera and Berruz and I have definitely been at Beauvoir conferences or like Philosophia conferences or SPEP conferences where we were all so I knew they were working on Beauvoir stuff and just basically asked them like, okay, send me all of your stuff so I can make sure that I engaged it. And I did send them the chapter to give an opportunity to like offer correctives or feedback or nuances to their work. So I made sure like it is not, as philosophers, a lot of times we're working on people who are dead. So it's nice to work on people who are actually still around that you can say like, okay, here's how I'm engaging your work. If you have any feedback or critiques or suggestions, and some of them were very generous in offering some pretty thorough, feedback and critique that helped tighten up that chapter for sure. So thanks for that question.
There's a question from Luca Pinelli in the chat, and I'm going to read it out loud because it doesn't show in the Facebook Live. So, Luca's question, I was thinking about Audre Lorde's poetry and essays on sexuality and lesbianism and how that potentially contrasts with Beauvoir's characterization of the lesbian in the second sex. Is that something you addressed in your work? I was wondering more broadly what you think about the intersection between race, gender, and sexuality as explored by Beauvoir and or Black feminists.
That's a great question. I love Audre Lorde so much, and the next book project I'm working on is actually an Audre Lorde book project. Where I do get more into like the poetry and some of the other essays and like Zami, all the essays in Sister Outsider, and a lot of the poetry. I'm scared of poetry. Like I love poetry, but I'm a little scared of it. So that's like something that I am still like very much dipping my toe in the water into engaging it. But all of that to say, yes, Audre Lorde definitely gets into all of those things across her writings. And there are some contrasts with Beauvoir and the second sex, with the lesbian in particular, and with some other issues as well. So I don't get into that specific contrast. And I had another version of this chapter where I got into more contrast between Lorde and Beauvoir directly. And then I decided to go in a different direction to really focus on this Master's Tools essay at this particular conference. So I do actually still have some stuff around that didn't make it into the book. But I this book definitely looks at the intersection of race, gender, and sexuality as explored by Beauvoir and these other Black feminist thinkers. And I do think about this more generally with Black feminist thinkers. So, but yeah, I'm thinking about all things Audre Lorde these days, notwithstanding what I was just saying about Octavia Butler. One of the other ways I'm thinking about Audre Lorde, Octavia Butler, actually in the Parable series in particular with Audre Lorde. So I am actually writing about this, Sabine. It's not a whole book on Butler, but there is an essay that I'm working on looking at this notion of the polycrisis, or these multiple crises happening simultaneously in the erotic, right? So it's informed by Lorde's conception of the erotic, and looking at Lauren in Parable of the Sower as like a protagonist that is an embodiment of this, because Lauren is very much focused on like her own sexuality and her sexual being. Like, it's like literally the world's falling apart and she's like getting it in with somebody. And I'm like the world's falling apart around you and sex is a priority. And it's like, yes, sex is a priority, right? Like, so I love that aspect of the text. So I think Lauren embodies the erotic in this sexual and sensual sense that Audre Lorde articulates, but she also embodies it in terms of this creativity and purpose and power, insofar as she's literally like mapping out, she's creating new worlds in a world that's falling apart, right? And so like the whole thing that she's doing with Earthseed, I also see as a representation of what Audre Lorde has in mind when she talks about the erotic. So I do actually have an essay drafted on that I'm working on and deciding where I'm going to send. Yeah.
Before Laurie Marceau, there's the question by Laurie Nichols that I'm going to read. What is your view of how Beauvoir would view the female sense of self today and the current racial dynamic?
You know, I would like to think that she would have come further along, but I'm not confident of that. And I'm basing that off of where I conclude my book, which is with interviews with Beauvoir on the second sex, right? So on the one hand, she's able to recognize like, oh, the way I did the second sex at the time wouldn't work now. And this is in like the 1970s, right? I think it's like 76. You know, it wouldn't work now. If I did a book like that, it would have to be more collaborative. I would have to be more inclusive of different women with different situations. So I think she's right about that. But the fact that she shifts from that statement to making these problematic claims about like Black women not knowing, and she takes up things from like Black women needing to listen to white women in the US and not knowing that they're oppressed. And then she gives other examples from like from Africa. And I'm just like, I think like some people are just stuck in a certain way of thinking that they know better than the people who are actually experiencing something. And I think she has these moments where there seems to be some insight and she lets go of that, but then she just kind of falls back into this like, I'm in a position where I can speak about this with authority, even more so than the people who are experiencing it. And so there's a kind of hubris there that I think would probably still persist today. So I don't know. So I think it would still be a problematic kind of racial dynamic. And, you know, I don't know how the sense of self might have shifted. I mean, I don't know. I don't know that it would be much different if we can track like the difference in her thought or the trajectory of her thought from like 1949 to 1979 and assume a similar trajectory from like 79 to now. I think she might still be stuck in a certain kind of way. Yeah.
Thank you, Kathryn. Laurie?
Can you guys hear me? Yeah. First of all, I just want to say thank you so much for writing this book. I've been waiting for a long time, and I had pre-ordered it, and I've only read the first chapter, but I'm really looking forward to getting into it. And my question follows on what you were just saying, actually, because I'm looking forward to the whole book, but especially that last part, the last section. And the first section. And I wanted to ask you if you could talk a little bit more about what you think as a philosopher. I'm not a philosopher, I'm a political theorist, and I always find that philosophers think more clearly than I do. And so I'm wondering if you can talk in some ways, and I'm wondering if you can talk about the category of lived experience. So if in fact Beauvoir had, you spoke at the beginning of your comments about how Beauvoir said that she should have included more kinds of lived experiences, but then she undermines herself. And as you were just saying now, you don't have any faith or confidence necessarily that she would do it even any better today. So I'm wondering about what you think about the category of lived experience more generally in relationship to how some of the ways in which Beauvoir uses the analogy and the woman as slave problematic trope and so on and so forth undermines her even use of lived experiences, right?
Mhm.
And so I'm wondering about that, if you could say a little bit more about that, and whether lived experience is a kind of way of doing philosophy that you think is valuable,
Mhm.
and if so, how we would do it well. And then, sorry to add one more thing onto that, is I'm a huge fan of Octavia Butler, and I'm thinking that she doesn't do, again, I'd like to hear from you about this, but her parable series are novels, and it's not really about lived experience. It's an imaginative, speculative framework where she is thinking in an intersectional way about, as you so beautifully put it, the forces that we see in her time that are gaining power and coming to a head. So that's a different way, it seems, of approaching kind of the problems that face us today.
So I'll start with the end and then backtrack. So with Octavia Butler, I think parable series is very much about lived experience, even if it is also this speculative fiction, right? It's both and. So the reason she can anticipate the problems of the future is because she's paying attention to the lived experience of the current problems, right? The reason she can anticipate a kind of neo-slavery is because she studied the history of slavery and the lived experience of the enslaved, right? And so you have these new versions of colonialism, you have these new versions of slavery that show up in the parable series, and it is a speculative version, but it's very historically informed. Like you could read like the strategies used to enslave people in the future, and they read as neo versions of those strategies that were used to enslave people in the past. You can read the strategies that she shares that people, once they get enslaved, use to resist their enslavers, and it's drawn from the strategies that were used from the lived experience of the enslaved in the past, right? So it's not an either lived experience or a speculative kind of imagining of what's possible for better or for worse. It's a speculative fiction that's very much rooted in history and lived experience of things that have actually happened in the past. So I think it's both and with Octavia Butler. I think with Beauvoir and the use or not of lived experience, I mean, I think she does bring in some lived experience there. I think a lot, like, I mean, the book itself is informed by her own questioning of, like, you know, whenever somebody asks me about myself, I have to start with this position of being a woman, right? And she starts out with like woman as womb and deals with all of these other kinds of things. So part of this is a whole thought experiment for her through her own, both her lived experience as woman, but also the ways in which she rejected like the limitations of that kind of categorization and things like that. So I think like her lived experience, I mean, you know, and again, in philosophy, I think philosophers tend to imagine they're these abstract, objective thinkers, but we're always writing from our lived experience, from our, you know, view of the world, from the people we're in conversation with and things like that. So I think her own lived experience is in there in some way. She does her own version of like historical analysis and research is like myths and all of these stories and all of these things. So there's a lot of interesting research in biology, right? Like there's all this interdisciplinary research that's going into that book. But I think also the issue is like, again, there's a centering of white womanness that doesn't necessarily, like sometimes it's named and sometimes it's not. And I think like this is where I really appreciated Sabine's work, like when she's talking about like with the, whether we're talking about the race gender analogy or like, again, more specifically, the woman and slave analogy, Sabine points out this triangle of the subject, the object, and the abject, right? And so she's like, okay, white women are basically trying to get to the white male subject position from the object position, but the ways that they're doing that is to distance themselves from, like, they put the slave in the object position, but the enslaved person is actually in the abject position, right? So it's like, how do you move closer from the object position to the subject position while constantly distancing yourself from the abject, from people who have the lived experience of being enslaved and not just the kind of Hegelian master slave dialectic, right? And so I think that's part of the lived experience that is missing, that I kind of reintegrate into the conversation by looking at Black women historians and philosophers who've taken up both theoretically, the framework of slavery, but also the lived experience of women who have been enslaved. And also, like, if you're really looking forward to the interviews, you can skip to the end and read the interviews and work your way back, right? Like, you know, the book wasn't written in the order that it's presented, right? Like, it has a certain kind of organizational structure. There is a nice buildup that happens, but, you know, I think as an author who's also a former professor who has taught parts of books, like, I write in a way that each chapter can be a standalone, like, they work really well together. There is a buildup that happens, but each chapter can stand on its own as well. So if you want to skip to the conclusion with the interviews and work your way back, you can do that. You have a permission slip to do that.
Dana?
Awesome, thank you. Kathryn, I have been looking forward to your book for so long. I've had it on my list of like, this is gonna get bought with funds next year. And then just in this conversation, I just like pulled the trigger and got it myself and was just like, let's just do it. We have to read this over the summer. I've been doing a little bit of thinking about Angela Davis and Beauvoir in terms of myth. And I kind of wanted to invite you to just sort of talk about that, you know, like share if you have, you know, what sort of things you wrote about Angela Davis and Beauvoir in the book, because I've really been thinking a lot about, you know, just to speak to what you were just saying, the way that Beauvoir sometimes just kind of like omits, like race is there, but it's omitted, right? So she's really thinking about the myth of the feminine, but it is certainly a kind of like racialized white feminine, perhaps. But then I'm like thinking about her call for us to really like sacrifice these myths of femininity and the conclusion, and how this is like the power of myth and the need to like create new myths even, which I think is interesting with your tendency towards Octavia Butler as well, just thinking about that. But then of course, thinking about Angela Davis's work with the myth of the Black rapist, which is I think really like, elevating the stakes in some ways of like really thinking about the power of myth and how, and we can just like see it so clearly how it structures our world. And so I've been thinking a little bit about Beauvoir's call of sacrificing these myths and really paying attention to the myths that structure us. But I wanted to invite you to just kind of like weigh in here with probably what you've already said in the book that I haven't been able to read yet. Yeah.
So all of this, versions of all of this are in the book. So one of the ways that Beauvoir is dealing with myth is looking at like literal myths around like how gender stereotypes and constructions of gender get created and replicated through myths and stories. So she looks at like different myths and different authors and things like that and kind of, you know, breaks down and debunks like these are all the ways that, you know, the woman is created in these problematic ways. But she's also going to look at like the specific myths and stereotypes of like, you know, the woman as meek and mild and all of this stuff, as well as like the Black person as docile, as all of these kinds of things. Of course, I mean, and we could talk about this with gender as well, but like with race in particular and with race in general, like at those intersections, it's always fascinating how completely contradictory stereotypes can coexist, right? So how you can have like, and you know, of course, Patricia Hill Collins gets into this, Bell Hooks, Angela Davis, and others. Like there are literally like, again, decades of literature on this, right? But how is it that like the mammy stereotype operates alongside the Jezebel stereotype, right? Like how are Black women simultaneously like this tempestuous devil, you know, Jezebel woman, right? Which justifies white folks raping the people that they've enslaved, right? And also function as these mammies who are literally nursing your white child, right? Like, so how do you have your white baby suckling at the breast of a Black woman and say that she's like this Jezebel, whatever, right? So there are these completely contradictory stereotypes that operate alongside of one another in order to perpetuate a certain kind of status quo with oppressive systems, right? So Angela Davis certainly gets into that. Bell Hooks gets into that. In terms of, so I do take up the myth of the Black rapist, and I take it up in the context of what I mentioned earlier, where like Beauvoir talks about sexual initiation as always being a form of rape when it comes to like white women, but when she actually takes up the sexual exploitation of Black women in the South, for example, she never describes it as rape. Right. And so it's not that she doesn't have the language for it, because she's already used the language for it, but she chose to use the language in one context and not use it in the other context. But yeah, I do get into like Angela Davis and Angela Davis actually uses Beauvoir's The Second Sex when she's talking about the sexual exploitation of Black women in the context of slavery, when Beauvoir's talking about like the biology of sex and animals and things like that. And so Davis kind of pulls from Beauvoir to look at how Black women are treated as animals and as property in the context of slavery. So she's not so much dealing with the myth in that content, in that sense of like the myth of woman, but she's dealing with like the analysis of biology and sex. And then, yeah, there is definitely like the myth of the Black male rapist, which I'm pretty sure that I do mention that in the text, but I don't go into detail with that as much. I think I do mention like Beauvoir has this place where she talks about, I think this is also in American Day by Day, so it's not so much in The Second Sex, which is why it's not so prominent in this book. But she talks about like white women being lynched for sleeping with Black men, which I have not, maybe the historians in here can help me out with that. Like I did look, I was not able to find any examples of that. Like, of course, Ida B. Wells talks about how Black men and women and children were lynched, right? Not just Black men, but of course the argument for the lynching of Black men was that they were rapists, right? So that's where the perpetuation of the myth of the Black male rapist comes, is it becomes this excuse for lynching Black men. But Ida B. Wells, like again, decades ago, over a century ago, had already kind of tracked that the people who were being lynched were not just Black men, but also women and children. And oftentimes why they were being lynched was because they were exercising their right to vote, or they had a business that was in competition with a white business, or they had a car and white people thought they shouldn't have a car, so they were like all of these other kinds of like, who do you think you are offenses that accounted for lynching that had nothing to do with Black men raping white women. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Qrescent and Sabine, would you like to add anything before we wrap this up?
No, only that I was really very happy to have the book and learned a lot of stuff. I mean, this is the thing, like you can work through these things for a long time, but then like for somebody to come and take on to do the real, like all this legwork of just like going into the details and writing it down. So, all my gratitude for that. I'd certainly be teaching it, but I'm no longer teaching. So
well, congratulations on your retirement. I love that. I love that for both of us.
I also love that for both of you. But yeah, I just wanted to also thank you. I think that's a really important point, Sabine, that this took a lot of labor and a lot of like legwork. So really appreciate you taking the time to do it and giving us the text that we'll be using.
The legwork and the headwork. So just
and the intellectual labor
misunderstood here.
No, not that. But I imagine, as you were saying, like some of that work becomes like you become bored with it, or you can become, So it's beautiful that you were able to sit with it, to allow us to be able to use it. Yeah. And I was thinking about your sort of notion of sort of matrilineal legacy and how you were just like an instantiation of that. And so just thank you so much.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it. And shout out, Sabine. I do love, like, again, your early essay. I know you wrote a later, more comprehensive book about this, but that triangle was like, I was working with that for a long time, of like the subject, the object, and the abject. And I also reached out to early on, well, maybe after the book went out for review, Elizabeth Spellman, because I'd read her as an undergraduate as well in her earlier critiques of The Second Sex. So there were some people like Elizabeth Spellman, like Margaret Simons, and then Sabine, or even Penelope Deutscher, who have done some of these critiques. And so like I did want to acknowledge that some of these critiques have been done, but we can also still need to pay attention to the Black women and women of color and feminists who have also engaged in these critiques, and also offered we're engaging in their own projects that we're not always tied to or subsumed under The Second Sex. So again, I became most excited about the project when I was done with the direct critiques of The Second Sex, which I think is important, which is why it's still in there. But the much more enriching aspect of the book was doing like that, mapping out that matrilineal legacy of, again, articulating our issues in on our own terms and in our own words, but also how we have engaged with this text. So thank you guys for reading
one
it.
last thing to say, because I think it's such an interesting sort of counter approach, because here's Beauvoir sort of, is that a word, like monologizing, like for hundreds of pages, and then comes, Kathryn Belle with giving us this whole, I don't know, like plethora of voices. I mean, even in terms of the methodology, I think that will be something that for students is really like an eye-opener, like you never think alone, but she pretends that she's quoting other people, but she's not thinking through and with like all this richness, not even with the white women much, opens another can of worms, but thank you for the book.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I now leave the floor to Gina Opiniano, the co-organizer of the Beauvoir webinar series, for the closing remarks.
Good evening. Good evening from the Philippines. On behalf of the Beauvoir webinar series project organizers, that's Marine and myself, for the International Simone de Beauvoir Society, I would like to thank you for being part of this webinar session and for your continued support for the series, which is now entering its 4th year. This project was conceived during the pandemic, initiated in 2020, and took off in 2021 with the humble intention of consolidating the Beauvoir community across various parts of the world by fostering conversations on Beauvoir's thoughts. Marine Rouch deserves special thanks for her efforts to sustain this project, often managing several sessions behind the scenes single-handedly. So merci, Marine. We are also pleased that our project continues post-pandemic, and we are even more delighted to discover that every session provides an opportunity to learn more about Beauvoir and fosters connections beyond what we initially intended. This session of the webinar, our second for this year, featured a thought-provoking discussion on the book Beauvoir and Belle, A Feminist Critique of the Second Sex. We extend our gratitude, of course, to Kathryn Sophia Belle, who was our speaker in January 2021 for the webinar session on Beauvoir, sexism, and racism, if you still remember. Thank you as well to Sabine Broeck and Qrescent Mason for bringing us this engaging discourse. Congratulations to Kathryn for her significant contribution to Beauvoir scholarship. We also would like to acknowledge our partners in this project: Department of Philosophy, Faculty of Arts and Letters, University of Santo Tomas, Manila, Philippines, and FAMESPA, University of Toulouse, France. If you also wish to be one of our partners, please feel free to contact us through Beauvoir webinar series at gmail.com. So Marine will share the email address in the chat, just in case. Finally, as the Society wishes to continue to foster conversations about and relevant to Beauvoir, we would like to share its forthcoming online seminars. The first one is a reading seminar on Les Belles Images, featuring Meryl Altman and Ashley Hsu. And the second one is Beauvoir and Marxism Research Group, featuring Katya Chichikoch and Anna Keshi. So the links are now shared in the chat. Another one is an in-person activity, the 29th International Conference of the Simone de Beauvoir Society, happening on June 28 to 29 at Freie Universität Berlin, organized by Manon Garcia and Esther Newhan. So the theme is Beauvoir as a moral philosopher. The link is also in the chat for more details. So watch out for the next topic and schedule of the Beauvoir webinar series through the Society's Facebook page and website. And please reach out to us if you wish to be part of the next sessions of our webinar series. On that note, thank you once again for your participation and support, and we look forward to continuing this journey together and exploring more of Beauvoir's legacies in future sessions. Thank you.